All right, so hi everybody, my name is Tiho, and yes, almost 4 years, I've had the opportunity to be part of the Temporal community, that being both cloud customers and of course open source users. You can typically find me both in the community forum and Slack all the time, so if you wanted to say hi. So during this time at Temporal, I've had a chance to talk probably to a lot of you over Zoom or Slack or something. I see a lot of familiar faces here. This replay is also very special for me because here we have my better half, my beautiful wife, Gabriela, here, and it's her first replay, and I think it's the first time she's seeing me speak live, so I better not mess up here, right? So, all right, so here we'll be talking about Temporal and Spring Boot. Spring Boot, I don't think I have to introduce that, is a very popular open source Java framework. It really simplifies creation of microservices. Spring Boot also has a lot of production-ready features, and a lot of which we will see in this talk today. Temporal Java SDK, I guess. It's also a very popular Java framework for building durable, reliable apps, right? It allows us to integrate with our temporal service. The SDK also is responsible for us to create both the clients and the workers. The clients that start workflow executions and interact with workflow executions, also your workers that actually run your code on your premises. It also has capabilities for building workflows as code, testing, observability, versioning, Nexus support, and many other things. So in this talk, we're going to focus mainly of looking at the integration between Spring Boot and the Temporal Java SDK. Now, one thing I also wanted to talk about is what is the Spring Boot starter? And I'm sure a lot of you guys are familiar with it already. But it's a project that simplifies integration of different libraries with Spring Boot. And some of the popular starters are the Web Starter, JPA, and Actuator, which we're actually going to look at quite in depth today. The Temporal Spring Boot starter is part of the Java SDK, and it allows us to integrate with Spring Boot fairly easily. So it brings durability and resilience to Spring apps. It is stable now. It used to be alpha for a while, but we went GA, so we have stable APIs now. It doesn't mean that the APIs will change, but we're adding to them all the time. And we do have support for both Spring Boot 2 and 3. Now, the whole thing about this integration is to make things simple. And the idea is that we have a single dependency in your Spring Boot apps to bring Temporal into your Spring applications. And it's basically a single dependency that brings in the SDK, the testing capabilities, and it does a lot more, which we're going to go through here in a minute. I'm just going to do a quick overview of what comes with this integration in the Temporal Spring Boot starter. We only have a couple of slides left, but then we're going to do a demo. So I'm going to attempt to do that, and hopefully it works out. So the first thing or one of the features that the Temporal Spring Boot starter brings is properties-based configuration that with Spring we're all used to. So we can basically configure our temporal namespaces, our connection to one or multiple targets. Since recently we also support property-based configurations for multiple namespaces on your Temporal servers or cloud. We also have worker definitions and auto discovery, so you no longer have to start registering your workflow and activity implementations with your workers, and it basically reduces a ton of boilerplate code. We also allow for, the title is a bit, code-based configuration. So on top of the property-based configuration that we allow you to do, there is always some configurations that you might not be able to configure using your application properties or YAML files. So the Temporal SDK Spring Boot starter also gives full ability to use code-based configuration. So you can tune your configs, such as worker configs, worker factory configs, connection configuration. You can really do fine-grained control over how you want to connect to your servers and how you want your workers and your code to behave. Another thing that the Temporal Spring Boot Starter allows you to do is to do dependency injection. So you can easily auto-wire workflow service, workflow clients. If you do temporal schedules, you can auto-wire a schedule client, things like that. So you no longer have to create this yourself. Once you define your workflow and activity types, everything is done for you. Another thing that's the last one on this list is the workers template. So your whole configuration as far as what workflows and activities get auto-discovered are actually exposed via what we call workers template. And we will actually show during the demo how that can become very useful for us. Activities, temporal activities can be implemented as beans or Spring components. That brings the whole DI aspect to your activity, so you can start auto-wiring your different resources or different beans that you define for your application. Another thing that you'll see on the second line, the second activity implementation annotation, we added this also to activities and workflows for worker auto-discovery, where now you can define your task queue on the activity level, and the Temporal SDK is going to find this and actually create a worker for you for this particular task queue and register this activity with the worker for you. So it's really kind of more a dynamic system that works along with a lot of what Spring Boot brings to the table. Now, testing, we know Spring Boot has Spring Boot Test, which allows you to do integration testing before you start deploying your applications in production. The Temporal Spring Boot Starter also integrates with that, where you can now auto-wire or bring in the whole test workflow environment without having to define it. So that is really cool there. And one of the things that's important, and what we're going to look at in a demo quite in depth probably, is along with that, Temporal SDK Spring Boot Starter integrates with a lot of production-ready features that Spring brings to the table. And one of them is the Spring Boot Actuator. So we know that if you want to build production-grade applications, it's not about only writing your code, testing, and things like that. We need metrics. We need tracing. We need observability of our applications. Even though the Temporal SDK brings that already, it's not as easy to expose as it is, for example, in Spring environment. So this is where we want to show off how we integrate with Spring Boot Actuator to bring all this observability, things like custom endpoints, things like what we're going to look at also is Graceful worker shutdowns and things like that, that now we can actually use the Spring Boot functionality with that. All right, so that's it, what I have for the slides, and maybe we can switch to my laptop if you guys don't mind. All right, do you guys see my screen? Not yet. All right, so what I'm going to attempt, I don't have anything pre-configured or running on my laptop. This is going to be just from scratch. One of the things that Spring Boot has is what we call the Spring Boot Initializer. It allows us to quickly build applications. And one of the things with the Spring Boot Initializer, it allows us two things. Number one, to define our dependencies or all the different features we want to use in our application. The second thing, it allows us to customize it. And a lot of times what I see is people don't really want to use the online version of the Spring Boot Initializer, but they want to create a custom set of dependencies. They're very particular for your organization and that you want to allow your developers to actually use. So this is a project I have on GitHub, and that is basically a bit of a customizer. So let's just do git clone. So what I'm doing now is just basically downloading this project. And that's it. And I'm going to cd into it. And if I can type, run it. So now I'm basically starting my customized Spring Boot initializer. And with that, we can start creating our projects. So let's go to our IDE, IntelliJ, pretty old version. And I'm going to create a new project. Now, one of the things that IntelliJ integrates with is Spring Boot, and it allows us to set as our project creator the Spring initializer. One thing, because we're running this customized Spring initializer on our local machine, you will see the URL here. It's going to point to our local host. So instead of running this against the online version, we're going to run it against our customization version. So this allows us to do things like pick a name of our project, group, artifact ID, things like that. It does allow us to pick the Java version, packaging, and all that. But, whoa, oh, sorry. I clicked too fast. Sorry about that. And if you guys don't mind, if we can start over. Sorry about that. So I'm just going to delete this project quick. All right, so let's do this again. Okay, so let's do this again. So I'm going to start my IntelliJ. Apologies for that, fat finger that. All right, so let's do this. So we do again, File, New Project, and single click. And here we have our predefined set of dependencies. We can pick the Spring Boot version. We said we support both Spring Boot 2 and 3. And here we can just click on things that we want. We're going to bring in the Temporal Spring Boot starter. We're going to bring Temporal Web for a little bit of visualization. The Spring Boot actuator, which we're going to use extensively. And then time leaf is just basically a way for us to bring in some easy way to do HTML and parsing like that. So once we do that, we're going to create our project. And this project is going to be basically a bit of a demo that already pre-integrates a lot of things. And then what we're going to do is basically open up our terminal and start this project. All right, now the first thing that I wanted to talk about when this project is starting, and let's make this a little bigger, is the Spring Boot integration with Docker. A lot of times we want to use things like metrics, open telemetry. When we have the need for tracing, we need to bring in some dependencies. And often as a developer, you have to work about standing that up yourself, things like that. Spring Boot comes already with Docker Compose integration. So when we start up our application, it's going to do a couple of things. It's going to connect to our temporal server, which in this case we use cloud, but it's also going to start some services for us. And all you have to do in Spring Boot is define a Docker Compose file, and basically you have that available. And as you see, we bring in Prometheus, we're bringing in Grafana, and we're bringing in tracing, in this case of Jaeger. And what that looks like is basically we're starting up our demo container, and we brought in these three things. Now you can customize this for your company and what you need to do. Now another thing that I wanted to show, let's go now to our browser, is start interacting with our application. So the first thing that I wanted to show is we talked earlier that we have configuration-based deployment, right? So if we start looking at our code a little bit, we'll see an application properties file in source main resources, and that is going to be our temporal config. And under temporal, we'll see we have connector cloud namespace. We set enable our HTTPS connection, which is needed, and we're also using API keys to connect to cloud in this case. We use worker auto discovery, and we will take a look at that in a second. And we define a package from which is the base package where Spring Boot is now going to start looking for our workflows and activities, auto-register them, create the workers, and set everything up for us. So create our worker factory, our workflow client, everything is done just through this configuration when our app starts up. Another thing that we can do, and we'll take a look, is we can do more control. In this case, for example, we're defining our worker capacity for certain task queues. So for this demo, we're going to limit the capacity of workers on the demo queue 2 to certain, only have 2 executor slots for activity tasks and a smaller set of pollers. What this allows us to do just through the configuration is to actually write things like worker info endpoints. And this is a custom Spring Actuator endpoint that we also have in our Spring Boot samples, in our Java samples, by the way, that all of this auto discovery that happened, we exposed it in a page that tells us exactly on this application, on how many workers we have, what workflows they have registered, what activities they have registered. For those workflows, what query, signal, and update handlers they have. And for activities, what are all the activity types that we got registered? And this is something that a lot of our users are asking us for in Slack and in the community. Hey, I have a worker. How do I expose what workflows and activities are registered with it? So with Spring Boot and Temporal Spring Boot Starter, you can basically do this pretty easily because everything is auto-discovered and exposed to you at the same time. All right, so the second thing that we can do is, because we have Spring Boot and temporal integration, we can do cool things like we can start our workflows from our REST APIs, right? So in this case, this is just a simple hello world workflow. I'm just gonna say hello world to myself, basically, and we can run it and we see the results of our workflow execution that's running on cloud. And okay, so that's great, right? But what's next? Another thing that we can start doing is we can use other features. For example, server sent events. And I'm going to start a second demo, which in this demo, what we're doing is more or less a batch processing type of demo. We're gonna send hello world or replay, hello replay message to a whole bunch of users. And at the same time, our activities are going to use server send events so we can actually visualize the result. And starting this is going to allow us to see many other features of this integration. So let's start doing that. And as you see, server send events. So as our workflow is starting to run activities, it's going to run 50 at a time for about probably 150, 200 messages they want to send. Our activities are interacting back with our UI by sending the server sent events back. And this integration is actually very simple. We will start looking at some code as well. Okay, so great. We got that done. What does that allow us to do? Sorry. The first thing is we can look at our metrics. As our worker started up and he started running our demo workflows, it generated metrics. Typically, it's been fairly hard to integrate metrics with temporal workers in your client because you have to write boilerplate code. With Temporal Spring Boot Spring Boot Starter, it really becomes fairly easy. We just have to define our management endpoints. And we define it for management. We have a web. We expose our Prometheus endpoint. And this is it. So a couple of lines of application properties YAML, and what do you get out of it is basically all the worker metrics and the client metrics out of the box for you. So yeah, so this actually makes this very, very easy. But looking at our metrics like this is probably not what we want to do. Another thing that you get out of the box with also Actuator is integration with Grafana. So one thing that we can do is we can start looking at our Grafana dashboards. Now remember, when we use Docker Compose integration, we actually started a Grafana instance. We configured it to talk to our Actuator endpoint that we exposed through Spring Boot application as a data source. So we can easily bring in a dashboard now to visualize our worker and client metrics. So a couple of things that I wanted to show here is this pretty simple dashboard. But one thing that kind of stands out is this last two graphs. And this is backlog. And this is something that a lot of our users ask. how do I see the backlog of workflow and activity tasks that we're generating through our application? And the backlog means is that basically, as we're running our workflows and activities, the interaction between the temporal service and your workers happens through tasks. Tasks include information that the server sends to your workers to say, hey, I've executed your activities. This timer fired. Something happened. This event came in, such as a signal that you have to start now processing in your workflow code. We expose currently backlog only as an API, not as a metric, but we will expose it as a metric soon. But one of the things that you can do with this integration is basically have scheduled tasks, Spring scheduled tasks, that generate metrics. So in this case, and I just wanted to show you, is we have a scheduled endpoint, and this is also a Spring Boot Actuator implementation, that runs our code at every 10 seconds, that actually hits the temporal API or the server to ask it for backlog of tasks for certain task use. So this is actually kind of what I wanted to show, and you can then expose that as a graph in our, how do you say, Grafana graphs. Now, okay, so we have seen metrics. We have seen visualizing metrics. The next thing we wanted to see is tracing. Now, with tracing configuration, we also use Actuator, and it's also a couple of lines of configuration, and that's it. So just with this and using the Temporal Spring Boot Starter in our Spring apps, we can actually use OpenTelemetry tracing, and that's it. And let's take a look at what that looks like. So for this, we're going to use Jaeger, right? And we have automatic propagation of tracing of spans between our REST API, which you remember we use like a little web page, a little form to fill in, a message or first name and last name. And we're going to automatically propagate our trace IDs to our workflow, to our activities, and also, so we have the full visualization of everything in this case. So let's take a look at that. Let's find our traces. And this is the trace for a longer workflow, the second one that started a whole bunch of our messages, right? And if we look at it, we see we start off with our REST endpoint, our post request from the form to our REST endpoint that received that message, hello replay 2025. And this REST endpoint started a workflow. So we can see that. So this workflow then, which is our message workflow, started a whole bunch of activities, each one which was maybe emailing or sending a Slack message or whatever you have it. And these are our send message activities. And you can really, through our tracing, follow the flow of our application from very start to end. But one thing that's actually really cool is we actually also propagate error messages. And in this case, we see that this send message activity actually failed and retried. And we can actually click on logs in Jaeger and see the full stack trace of our activity failure in this case as well. So this is kind of the power of using the Temporal Spring Boot Starter with Actuator and actually open tracing, that you can have full visualization of your of what's going on in your application. All right, so how much time do we have left? 5 minutes. All right. So let's take a look at a couple more things, if you guys don't mind. So the way what I'm going to show is just a couple of lines of code. This is how you define your workflow implementation. We have a new annotation called workflow impl, where you define a task. You can pull this from properties as well, right? Now, once you have this, as we said, worker auto discover is going to find it, and it's going to create your temporal worker, register this with the worker, apply all your configurations, such as the capacity, of this worker on this workflow, on this task queue, and then it's going to apply our custom or code-based configuration on top of that as well. Similarly for your activities, we have same thing. The only thing is we have add component and activity implementation, and then also task queues. Now here you can define multiple task queues. If you want an activity to be registered with multiple workers, you just define more of that. So you can basically control how many workers are created and what task queues are they going to listen to. And here you can start auto-wiring. For example, in here we just auto-wire a message controller that sends all the server-send events back to our web app that we saw the messages showing up. And that's it. Another thing I wanted to show is our auto-config. And in this case, we have beans that you can define where you can start configuring different things. Like in this case, we have full customization of workflow client options. Here we can start customizing our worker factory options. So you can define, for example, max thread count, different things like that. We have things like, for example, worker options. In this case, we can set things like sticky task queue drain timeout, which is very important for graceful shutdowns. We can disable eager activities. You have full control. That's what I'm trying to say. So with that, another thing, the last thing that I wanted to show is going back to our cool little demo app, is at the end of the day, we can do graceful shutdowns. And this is very important. When you want to shut down your pod or your container, you might have workflows and activities running. And the temporal SDK does have ability for graceful shutdown, meaning you give the worker ability to process for a certain amount of time anything that it's doing, if it's currently still running some workflows, if it's still running some activities. So you don't want to forcefully shut down your application and basically stop everything you're doing, but you want to give the worker some time to complete whatever it's currently doing and then shut down. Spring Boot also has graceful shutdown through the actuator. And what we can actually do is pull them in together. We can shut down gracefully Spring Boot, which is then going to trigger a graceful shutdown over workers, and Spring is going to wait until temporal tells it, I'm okay, now you can shut down. So let's take a look at that. So going back here, we can see that we have initiated graceful worker shutdown on the temporal side with that as well. So with that, that is all I had for this demo. If there's any questions left, please let me know.
Do you need a mic? I'll bring a mic.
Thanks. So you showed the tracing integration, and so from what you showed, one trace is created for the execution of a workflow, but in case that this workflow is part of a larger distributed system, is the context propagated so that not a new trace is initialized, but everything is treated as spans of this broader context?
Yes, we propagate with the MDC. So yes, you can propagate that either via MDC, or when you start workflow executions, you can propagate traces via headers. So we have temporal headers. So when you start a new workflow execution, you can pass in through the headers the span ID and the trace ID that you want to propagate then to the workflow execution that you're starting. Does that?
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Okay, I'll go with you and then you.
Okay, so it's a Spring Boot application on top of Temporal Worker. So
the worker is running within the Spring Boot application.
right, so when you want to start a workflow, do you actually have to create individual endpoints for each workflow, or is there a way to automatically send a request?
That's a great question. So currently, no. That would be actually a really cool project if somebody from the community wants to help, is to auto-discover your workflow types and, for example, look at all the signal and the query methods and auto-expose REST endpoints for those, for your application. No, that we don't have that out of the box yet, but that would be something cool to implement if anybody wanted to. Or we can try for a sample, for example. Does that help?
Yeah, that's very helpful.
Thank you.
Hello. So for the metrics visualization, I saw we are like using like Grafana and Jagger for the tracing. How easy is it to integrate with like Datadog if I want to send this metrics to Datadog?
Yeah, and Spring Boot also has that. We have the, it's actually all about the exporter. So for the exporter that I used in this demo project, we pushed it to Jaeger. You can have, Spring does have a Datadog exporter for Micrometer, and you can just plug that, the dependency in, and that's pretty much it. So yeah, the endpoint we defined was the Jaeger HTTP endpoint for the receiver for hotel metrics, but you can just change a couple of dependencies and one little configuration point in this demo, and you can push to Datadog or whatever else you want to.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Anybody else? Oh, there's
Cool.
one in the
Do we
back.
have time for another question or? Okay, one more.
All right.
Hi.
Hi.
Is there a possibility to pass like custom information in a context between a workflow and activity? Not like an activity input, but in a shared context or something like that?
Yeah, you can, and all of our SDKs support that.
Okay.
Yeah, so we do have a context that you can pass from your workflow to activities.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
We don't, from activities, not back to workflow.
Yeah,
but
yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
that does exist. There's one more. Yeah. Go ahead. It was a short question, so maybe we can take one more.
Only one last. It's not so long. How your work supports the versioning part, which is for us very important.
Okay, so yeah, you said it's a short question, but Temporal does support the different types of versionings. We support the versioning API that you do basically in your code. So long story short, Temporal does allow you to have multiple versions of the same workflow type while you have multiple executions running on different versions at the same time. We also, I see Drew over there, he's going to, I believe, do a talk about some new features that we're adding about worker versioning, so you should probably attend that. We also have other types of versioning, which is either task queue-based versioning, where every time you make a change, you change task queues, and things like that. But for here, if you version and if you choose the versioning or the patching API, so you do it in code, you still have to do it. And then you have to restart your workers to apply those changes. So there is nothing out of magic that's happening here.